The wind on Kareth 9 did not blow, it carved. That was the first thing Sergeant Dara Osai noticed when the dropship's ramp cracked open. Not the cold, not the dark, not the alien smell of sulfur and old ice that hit him like a fist. It was the wind. It moved between the pressure ridges the way a blade moves between ribs, finding the gaps, using them. He pulled his thermal liner tight against his jaw and stepped down onto ground that crunched under his boots like broken teeth. "Atmospheric sensors confirm," said the ship's AI in his earpiece. "Surface temperature, -61 Celsius. Wind chill effective temperature, -89. You have approximately 6 hours of functional core heat in your suit at this exposure level before tissue damage begins." "Noted," Dara said. "Thank you, VERA, very uplifting. I also detect 2 biosignatures approximately 800 meters northeast. Non-human. Life signs are weak." He stood still for a moment. The dropship's running lights painted a pale orange wedge across the ice. Behind him, the ramp hissed shut standard protocol on a non-hospitable surface, which this emphatically was. Around him, Kareth 9 extended in every direction, a gray-white frozen plain ringed by pressure ridges that rose 30 meters in places, their undersides glassy and dark. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the Keth Collective's forward outpost was burning, had been burning for 11 hours. The distress beacon had gone offline 8 hours ago. Dara had been the closest asset. That was the whole reason. Closest asset, single operator, standard search and extract. He had done this 40 times. He started walking northeast. The biosignatures resolved after 600 meters into 2 figures huddled against the base of the largest pressure ridge, partially sheltered from the worst of the wind by an overhang of ice that jutted out like a broken jaw. They were pressed together, their backs to the ridge, their arms wrapped around each other in a way that looked more like desperation than warmth. They were wearing what had once been technical cold weather gear, Keth pattern, segmented, the kind rated to -40 and not a degree below, and it had failed them in 2 or 3 places he could see from here, the outer layer torn open, the thermal gel inside the seams already frozen to a crust. He stopped 5 meters away and crouched so he wasn't looming. They were Veth. That was his first clear read on them. Long-limbed, 4-fingered, with the distinctive triple-ridge brow structure that Veth females carried, a hard calcified crown that served as a heat sink in the species' native climate, which was, inconveniently, not this. Their skin, which should have been the deep amber bronze of a healthy Veth adult, had gone to a gray-blue at the extremities. Frostbite, early stage. Maybe mid. Their eyes, large, copper-colored with horizontal pupils, were open but barely tracking. The smaller one, younger by the look of her bone structure, was shaking in a way that looked involuntary. The larger one had stopped shaking, which was worse. When they had no more energy left to shiver, the body stopped trying. "Hey," Dara said. He kept his voice low and even. "Don't panic, I'm human. I'm not going to hurt you." The larger one focused on him with visible effort. Her mouth moved. What came out was Veth, which he spoke at a functional level. Roughly translated, she said, "There are more of us. There were more of us, inside the outpost." "I know," he said. "The outpost is compromised. Are there any survivors inside?" A long pause. The wind filled it. "No," she said. He nodded once. Then he reached into his kit, pulled out 2 emergency thermal blankets, the kind that folded to the size of a playing card and unfolded to 2 meters of reflective mylar, and moved forward slowly, the way you moved toward a wounded animal, showing his hands at every step. He wrapped the first one around the smaller girl, tucking it under her arms and over her shoulders. She flinched at the contact and then went still. Her shaking didn't stop, but it changed character, less frantic, more controlled. He wrapped the second one around the larger girl and she caught it with both hands, pulling it tight herself, which was a good sign. That meant the motor function was still there. "My name is Dara," he said. "What are yours?" The larger one said, "Sevi." The smaller one looked at him for a long moment, assessing, copper eyes picking over his face with an intensity that he recognized. It was the look of someone who had been afraid for so long that they had moved past fear into something cold and analytical. Then she said, "Aka." "Sevi, Aka," he looked at them both. "Can you walk?" Sevi tested her legs and nodded slowly. Aka tried and the left one buckled. Not broken, he thought. The way she caught herself and redistributed her weight said the joint was working, just the muscles had seized. Cold damage, temporary. Probably. "Okay," he said. "I've got a ship 800 meters south. Warm, pressurized food and medical supplies. Here is what we're going to do." He looked at Aka. "You're going to put your arm around my neck and I'm going to take most of your weight. You're going to tell me if anything hurts more than it should. Sevi, you walk on my right and you keep that blanket pulled tight. If the wind changes direction, lean into me, not away. Understand?" They looked at each other. Something passed between them, some quick private calculation in a language he didn't have the vocabulary for, some judgment rendered about whether this stranger with the strange flat face and the warm suit was worth trusting. Sevi said something to Aka in a lower register of Veth that he didn't quite catch. Aka responded with two words that he did. He came. That seemed to settle it. He helped Aka to her feet. She was lighter than he expected. Veth bone structure was hollow, evolved for speed over mass, and she gripped his shoulder with a hand that felt like cold iron. He adjusted his stance, checked his footing on the ice, and started south. They walked. The wind did its work. He leaned into it. He had been walking for 3 minutes when Vera spoke in his ear again. "Sergeant Os, I'm reading a Keth collective tactical formation approximately 1.2 kilometers northwest and closing. 12 combatants. They appear to be tracking the same biosignatures you are. How long until they reach our position?" "At their current rate, 19 minutes. Your ETA to the ship is approximately 14 minutes at current pace. Then we have 5 minutes to spare. That assumes your current pace. Miss Aka's leg appears to be slowing." "I know." He tightened his grip on Aka's waist. "We'll manage." The Keth. He had been afraid of this. The Keth collective was the reason the outpost was burning, the reason those 11 biosignatures had gone offline, the reason he was walking across a frozen hell at 300 hours with 2 half-frozen aliens leaning on his shoulder. The Keth were the reason for a lot of things lately. They were not, in the conventional sense, monstrous. That was the thing about the Keth that the briefings always struggled with. They looked almost reasonable at first contact. Bilateral symmetry, roughly humanoid proportion, complex language, sophisticated technology. They had culture, philosophy, art. They had been in the galactic community for 600 years longer than humanity. The other species had learned to navigate them, trade with them, defer to them on matters of territorial dispute. What the briefings did not adequately convey was the specific kind of philosophy the Keth had developed in 600 years of unchallenged dominance. A philosophy of absolute hierarchy, of thermodynamic logic, in which every interaction in the universe resolved to predator and prey, dominant and subordinate, those who shaped events and those who were shaped. The Veth, who had the misfortune of sharing a star cluster with the Keth, had been designated subordinate for 200 years. The outpost Dara was walking away from had been a Veth scientific station, a research team, 11 people trying to map ice-core geological records on a frozen moon. The Keth did not require provocation. They required only proximity. Sevi said behind him, "Are they coming?" He didn't answer immediately. There was a calculation to be made about what information helped people walk faster and what information made them freeze. "Yes," he said, "but we're faster." "You don't know that," Aka said against his shoulder. Her voice was stronger than he expected, given everything. "I know we have a ship and they don't, and I know where my ship is and they don't. Both of those things help us." Aka was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you come? Your kind is not in this sector by treaty." "My kind breaks treaties occasionally." He paused. "Actually, my kind wrote a separate treaty specifically for situations like this. The Karath 9 sector is Veth-claimed space. Veth and humanity have a mutual aid agreement. It's about 600 pages long and very boring, but one of the clauses says that if there is a distress signal from a Veth installation and the nearest available response asset is human, said human goes and helps. So here I am." "The Keth don't recognize that treaty," Sevi said. "I know." He watched the ice ahead of him picking the path. "They also don't recognize human territorial claims in the outer belt, or Erath resource rights in the Pelin corridor, or the consortium's jurisdiction over the drift lanes. The Keth are not very big on recognizing things. That's kind of the problem with them." They crested a low ice ridge. On the other side, 800 meters away, the dropship's running lights were still burning orange in the dark. At the sight of them, he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been holding tight. Aka made a small sound that was not quite a word. "Almost there," he said. They were 400 meters out when VERA said, "Sergeant, the Keth formation has increased speed. New ETA to your position, 11 minutes. And our ETA to the ship, 7 minutes at current pace." "Good." However, a pause. VERA was not an AI that paused unless the pause was warranted. "I'm reading a secondary formation I previously classified as static geology. It is not geology. It is 6 additional Keth combatants positioned between us and the ship. They were waiting." He stopped walking. In front of him, 400 meters away, the pale orange of the running lights caught 6 shapes that had not been there when he came down that ramp. They were arrayed in a line, low to the ice, the way Keth positioned themselves when they were waiting for prey to walk into them. They were good at this. They had been doing this for 600 years. "How fast can you run?" he asked. Neither Sevi nor Aka answered immediately. He turned and looked at them. Sevi was doing the copper-eyed calculation again. Aka's face was harder to read. The frostbite had tightened the skin around her jaw and brow, which made every expression look carved. "Aka," he said, "the leg, how bad is it actually?" "I can bear weight." "That is not what I asked." "A beat, it will hurt." "It will hurt for a few minutes or it will hurt worse later. Those are the options." He looked at her directly. "I know you just watched 11 people die. I know you've been freezing against a rock for however many hours. I know you're running on nothing and the cold has been in your bones long enough to change the way everything feels. And I know asking you to run right now is one of the worst things I could ask." He paused. "I'm asking you to run right now." Something shifted in Aka's face. Not resolution exactly, more like the moment when a person stops negotiating with themselves and just moves. "Tell me when," she said. He unslung the compact plasma carbine from his back. It was rated for 12 discharges at full power on a standard pack, and he had a full pack. He checked the charge indicator, green, full, and then looked at the 6 shapes in the dark ahead. The Keth did not respond to warning shots. Their philosophy of hierarchy meant that any act of aggression too small to be decisive was read as weakness. You did not negotiate with a dominant caste by shooting near them. You either did not shoot at all, or you shot to end the conversation. He had been briefed on this. He'd also been briefed on the Keth's reaction time, their thermal signatures, and their formation doctrine, which said that when a frontal unit took casualties, the formation compressed inward before it expanded outward. A 1-second window, maybe 2. "VERA," he said quietly. "Ramp down on my mark. Full interior lights, maximum heat. I want it to look like a beacon." "Understood. Note that activating full interior lights will also expose our position to the rear formation." "I know. It'll give the rear formation something to track toward besides us. Mark." The ship lit up like a sunrise. He stepped forward, raised the carbine, and put 3 shots in a spread pattern across the front of the Keth line, not at individual targets but at the ground between them, punching 3 bright plasma craters in the ice that threw light and heat and the crack of superheated steam into the air. The line flinched. He had known it would. Even Keth flinched. He turned to Sevi and Aka. "Now," he said. They ran. Aka ran like she was angry at the ground. That was the only way he could describe it, not graceful, not efficient, the bad leg throwing her gait sideways on every third stride. But she put her head down, and she moved with a fury that was almost violent in its intensity, like she was personally offended by the distance between her and the ship's ramp. Sevi ran in long loping strides that covered ground fast, staying close to Aka, half reaching back on the uneven stretches in case she needed catching. He ran behind them and kept his eyes on the dark. The Keth line reformed faster than the briefing said they would. They always did. There was a certain arrogance to the Keth that worked in their favor tactically. They recovered from surprise quickly because they fundamentally did not believe that prey was capable of surprising them, and so the surprise did not linger. Within 4 seconds the line had tightened and was moving. He stopped, turned, put 2 more shots down, not at the ground this time, at the outer edges of the formation, catching the flankers, forcing the line to compress again. 1 second, 2 seconds. He turned back and ran. The ramp was right there. Sevi hit it first, stumbling slightly on the transition from ice to metal, catching herself on the handrail. Aka hit it 3 strides later, and her bad leg went out on the angle of the ramp, and she went down hard on one knee. But she had her hands out and she caught herself, and she was already pushing back up before he reached her. He grabbed her upper arm and hauled her upright in one movement without breaking stride, and they went up the ramp together. "Vera, ramp up. Now get us off the surface." The ramp began to rise before Aka's second foot was fully inside. He could hear the ship's engines already cycling. Vera had anticipated the order, which was one of the things he deeply valued about Vera. And then the ramp sealed, and the noise of the wind cut off like a switch had been thrown. The silence was enormous. Sevi stood in the middle of the hold, her thermal blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, and stared at the sealed ramp. Then she sat down on the hold floor, slowly and deliberately, with the air of someone who had been storing up the act of sitting for a very long time. Aka stood at the wall and pressed her forehead against the warm metal of the hull. He stood in the center of the hold, breathing hard, the carbine still in his hands. After a moment he clicked the safety on and set it in the rack. The ship shuddered as the engines hit full thrust, pressing them all slightly toward the floor, and then they were climbing. "Vera," he said. "We're clear," she said. "Both formations are on the surface. They have nothing in this sector with atmospheric escape capacity. You are free and clear, Sergeant." He nodded, breathed out. Then he went to the storage locker, pulled out 3 ration packs and a medical kit and 2 spare thermals, and sat down on the hold floor next to Sevi. "You should eat something," he said, and handed her the first ration pack. She took it and looked at it and then looked at him. "This is human food. It's calibrated for about 60% of known oxygen-breathing species," he said. "The VETH metabolic profile matches enough of the base compounds that it'll keep you functional. It won't taste good." "It's warm," she said, and tore it open. He brought the second pack to Aka and set it beside her. She had slid down the whole wall to sitting, her bad leg extended in front of her, and she was looking at nothing in particular with the copper eyes half-lidded. He crouched beside her. "Let me look at the leg," he said. She shifted enough to let him work. He cut the lower section of the outer suit layer away. It was already compromised, no point preserving it, and ran a bioscan over the knee and calf. The readout was not great. The joint was intact, no fracture, but the soft tissue had taken real cold damage, and there was early-stage vascular constriction in the calf that would turn into something serious if it wasn't addressed. He pulled the medical kit open and started on the treatment protocol, which for Veth physiology he had to run from memory because the kit's AI was calibrated for humans, and he'd had to learn the adjustments in training. Aka watched him work. After a while she said, "You know Veth medicine. Basic field protocols, enough." "Why?" He considered the question. It was a real question. He could hear that, not rhetorical, not hostile. Genuine curiosity about why a human soldier in a sector he had no treaty standing to be in would know enough Veth biology to treat frostbite in the dark on a rising dropship. "Because when I signed the mutual aid agreement deployment," he said, "they gave me a 7-week training course in the physiology of every species covered under the treaty. And because," he paused, adjusting the thermal coupling around her calf, "because this isn't the first time I've done something like this." Aka was quiet. The ship hummed around them. "The Keth," she said finally, "they don't understand that." "What the training?" "The preparing." She looked at him steadily. "They have been dominant for 600 years. They have never needed to learn what someone else's pain feels like. It does not occur to them to prepare for the possibility that they might need to." A pause. "That is why your kind frightens them." He looked up from the calf. "Humanity frightens the Keth." "Deeply?" She said it simply, without drama. "You have been in the galactic community for 40 years. You have no ancient claim, no ancestral territory, no centuries of precedent. You should, by every logic the Keth understand, be subordinate. Instead, you show up in sectors where you have no standing, and you know our medicine, and you make treaties with every species who will sit at a table with you, and you prepare for everything." She paused again. "They don't know what to do with that." He thought about this while he finished the calf treatment. He wrapped the thermal bandage in 2 layers, sealed it, ran the bioscan again. "Better. Not great, but better." "How are you doing?" he asked Sevi across the hold. Sevi had eaten most of the ration pack and was sitting with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up. She looked exhausted in the profound way that came from hours of sustained terror followed by sudden safety. Not tired, but emptied out. The body finally letting go of the adrenaline and presenting the bill. "I'm alive," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are." He went to the small galley. The ship was a single-operator scout, not designed for hospitality, but there was a heating unit and a water recycler, and made 3 cups of the synthetic broth that he kept in the kit, because on night ops in cold environments it was the fastest way to raise core temperature. It had no real taste. It was roughly 200 calories and about 58 degrees Celsius, and it was, in his professional assessment, the second most useful thing in his kit after the plasma carbine. He brought 2 cups back and handed one to each of them. Sevi wrapped both hands around hers and closed her eyes. He saw, for just a moment, the version of her that existed before the outpost, before the cold, before the 11 people who weren't coming back, young, still, with the particular fragility of someone who had not yet learned how to carry the weight of the world and had just been handed it without warning. Aka took her cup and said quietly, "There's something I need to tell you." He sat down with his own cup. "Okay." The outpost wasn't just geological research. She looked at him with the direct copper-eyed gaze that he was starting to understand meant she was going to say something she'd been deciding whether to say for a while. "We found something in the ice cores, something old, not geological, artificial. A signal array, partially intact, buried under 400 meters of ice. Pre-Keth, pre-Veth, pre-everything in the current galactic community. We had been studying it for 6 weeks." He held his cup and said nothing. "The Keth found out," she said. "That's why they came, not to assert territorial dominance, to destroy the data. Everything we'd recorded, every scan and analysis, every translation attempt, they wanted it gone." She paused. "They destroyed the outpost to make sure no one else found out about the array." "Did it work?" he asked. Aka looked at him steadily. Then she reached inside her suit, under the thermal layer and removed a small data chip in a sealed biometric case. She held it out on her palm. "We had a copy protocol," she said. "The moment our sensors detected the Keth approach, everything went to this. The whole 6 weeks, every scan, every translation." She paused. "The Keth killed 11 people to stop this information from reaching anyone. I would like it to reach someone." He looked at the chip for a long moment. Then he reached out and took it carefully, the way you took something that mattered, and put it in the sealed inner pocket of his suit where it would stay warm against his chest. "Okay," he said. Sevi opened her eyes and looked at him. "That's it, you just okay. What would be more useful?" A pause. Then Sevi, despite everything, made a sound that he recognized after a moment as the Veth equivalent of a short laugh. They sat in the warm hold of the ship for a while. The engines were smooth now, they were out of atmosphere in the transition zone, and VERA was laying in a course to the nearest consolidated world's way station. 4 hours. He should sleep. He knew he should sleep. He didn't. After a while Sevi said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Your people, humanity." She turned the word over like she was testing the weight of it. "Why do you do this?" "Do what?" She made a gesture that encompassed vaguely all of it, the ship, the ice, the carbine, him. "This, all of this. The treaties and the preparations and the showing up in sectors where you technically are not supposed to be, to pull strangers off the ice in the middle of the night. You've been in the community for 40 years. You're still new. You have nothing to gain from this. The risk-to-benefit calculation is not how we think," he said. "Then how do you think?" He considered it seriously. It deserved a serious answer. "When I was a kid," he said, "my grandmother used to tell a story, very old story from the part of the world my family comes from, about a man who came across 2 travelers on a road who were hurt and couldn't continue. And everyone who came by had a reason not to stop, too busy, wrong kind of people, not their responsibility, someone else would handle it. And this one person stopped. Not because he knew them, not because there was something in it for him. Just because they needed help, and he was there." He paused. "We've been telling that story for a very long time," he said. "We've told it in 100 different versions, in 100 different languages, on every continent we ever lived on. We told it before we knew there were other planets, before we knew there were other species, before we had any concept of what a galactic community even was. We just kept telling it." He looked at his cup. "When we finally got out here and found out there were other people, I think a lot of us just assumed the story still applied." Sevi looked at him for a very long time. "The Keth have a story too," she said finally. "A very old one, about the first dominant species, the ones who shaped the early galaxy. They tell it as a triumph, how the strong claimed what they needed and the weak adapted or disappeared. They've told that story for 600 years. "I know," he said. "You've been telling yours for longer." "A lot longer," he said. "We've been telling ours since before we could write it down." Aka had been quiet through this. She was looking at the ceiling of the hold now, the data chip case presumably back in her suit, her cup of broth empty in her hands. After a long moment she said, without looking at him, "What is in the array?" "I don't know yet. I haven't looked at the chip." "I have," she said. "I spent the last 3 hours before the Keth arrived running translation algorithms. I didn't finish, but I got far enough to understand one thing." She lowered her gaze to the floor. "The species that built it, they were here before everyone, before the Keth. Before the old galactic community, before anything that we know of." A pause. "They left a message in the array, in every language they could anticipate, every encoding, every format, as if they knew someday someone would find it." "What does the message say?" he asked. She looked at him. "It says, 'Do not let the dominant caste destroy what they fear.'" She said it flatly, without inflection, the way you said something that had already happened and you were still catching up to. "They knew. Whatever they were, they knew. They watched their own galaxy develop, and they watched what the Keth's ancestors did, and they left a warning in the ice 400 meters down, in the one place the Keth never thought to look. She paused. And then they were gone. The ship hummed. He thought about ancient species and long warnings, and the specific kind of stubborn hope it took to bury a message in the ice of a frozen moon, and believe that someday someone worth telling would come along. "Sounds like they had a story too," he said. Aka looked at him with something in her expression that he couldn't fully read: recognition, maybe, or surprise at recognition. Then she looked back at the ceiling and didn't say anything else, and that was fine. Not every conversation needed an ending. He drank his broth. It still had no taste. It was still warm. At some point Sevi fell asleep sitting up, the thermal blanket pulled around her like a tent, her head tipped against the hull wall. Her breathing evened out and deepened, and the tension that had been living in her shoulders since he'd found her gradually let go, not all at once but in stages, like a bow being unstrung. Aka did not sleep. She sat with her bad leg extended and her eyes half open, and she watched the wall like it might tell her something. He didn't push her. Some nights the body needed sleep, and some nights the mind needed to stay awake a while and process, and he had long since stopped trying to argue with either. He ran system checks instead. It gave him something to do. VERA reported all systems nominal, course confirmed, ETA to way station 3 hours 40 minutes. He checked the charge on the carbine pack, 9 discharges remaining. He'd used 3 on the ice. Checked the medical kit. Checked the data integrity on the communication suite. Everything fine. Everything working. The ordinary miracle of functional equipment after a bad night. At some point VERA said, quietly enough not to wake Sevi, "Sergeant, Keth long-range communication array. They're broadcasting." "What are they saying?" "They are reporting the outpost destruction as a territorial enforcement action. Standard protocol. They're also," a pause, "they're reporting that the Veth research team was fully neutralized. No survivors. Data destroyed." He looked across the hold at Aka. "They're wrong," he said. "On both counts," VERA said. Aka had heard. He could tell by the slight change in her posture, not grief exactly, more like the quiet settling of something that had been suspended. The 11 people were gone. The Keth were lying about it to the entire galactic community. Both of those things were true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other out. "VERA," he said, "when we hit the way station, I want you to draft a full incident report. Timestamp, coordinates, Keth formation identifiers, the works. Route it to Consolidated Worlds Command, Veth Provisional Authority, the Human Diplomatic Liaison Office, and the Open Galactic Record." "That will cause a significant diplomatic incident," VERA said. "It will cause a necessary one." A pause. "Understood, drafting." Aka said, "The Keth will deny it." "Yes." The galactic community has largely deferred to Keth authority for 600 years. Most of the major species are, she paused, searching for the word, cautious about confronting them directly. "Yes," he said. "You're not." "We're new," he said. "We don't have 600 years of learned deference. We haven't been convinced yet that the dominant caste is inevitable." He looked at her. "That's not bravery. That's just, we don't know better yet." Aka looked at him with those level copper eyes and said, "I think you know exactly what you're doing." He didn't argue with that. The way station came into view as a cluster of lights against the black, growing from a faint smear to a recognizable structure over the last 30 minutes of approach. It was a Consolidated Worlds facility, one of the neutral territory hubs that served as the backbone of interspecies commerce and communication this far from any single species' home territory. 6 species maintained permanent diplomatic presences there. The Keth did not. The Keth considered neutral territory to be a fiction invented by inferior species who didn't want to acknowledge the actual hierarchy of the galaxy. Dara thought about the ancient array under 400 meters of ice, and the message in every language, and the species that had been here before all of them, and he thought, someone tried this before. Someone tried to hold the line against the dominant caste. Someone buried a warning and then disappeared. He thought about that, and then he thought about the 9,000 years of stories that humanity had been telling each other about stopping on the road, about pulling people off the ice, about the math of help that didn't balance on paper but somehow kept adding up. Sevi woke as they docked. She blinked, looked around, oriented herself. Then she looked at him with a directness that reminded him of Aka, that same copyright evaluation. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "we go inside. You get medical attention, a real meal, and a communication line to wherever your people are. The data chip goes to the Veth Science Authority and to Consolidated Worlds and to every translation team that has the clearance to look at it." He paused. "And the incident report goes out. And after that?" "After that, it's above my pay grade," he said. "I'm a sergeant. I find people who need finding and I get them out. What the diplomats do with it afterward is their problem." Sevi looked at him for another long moment. Then she said in Veth, the more formal register, the one used for things that mattered, "Thank you." He nodded, "You're welcome." Aka stood, testing the leg. It held. He watched her find her balance and then he stepped back to give her space to do it on her own, because that was the kind of help she needed now, not assistance, just room. She stood straight. She looked at the docking hatch. Then she looked at him and said, "The story your grandmother told." "Yes." "The person who stopped on the road." A pause. "In the story, did it work out?" He thought about it, about all the versions, all the languages, all the centuries. "Sometimes yes," he said. "Sometimes the people who stopped got hurt too. Sometimes the dominant caste sent someone to punish them for interfering. Sometimes the road was just a road and nothing changed." He looked at her. "But we kept telling the story. That has to mean something." Aka held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded, a single deliberate nod, the kind that wasn't agreement exactly but acknowledgement. "I see you. I hear what you're saying. I will carry that." The docking hatch opened. Warm light came through from the way station interior, the yellow-white of standard Consolidated Worlds lighting, designed to be tolerable to the majority of oxygen-breathing species' visual spectra. Somewhere beyond it, there would be a medical bay, and food that wasn't calibrated to 60% of species, and people who knew Veth biology better than field protocol memory, and communication lines running in every direction across the sector. Sevi went through first, and then Aka, steady on the healed leg, and Dara came last, pausing for a moment in the hatch with the warm light ahead of him and the black behind him. He thought about the chip in his inner pocket, warm against his chest. A 6-week record of something buried 400 meters down, left by people who had seen this before and wanted someone to know. A message in every language. A message for whoever showed up. He thought about 12 Keth combatants on a frozen moon, lying to the galactic record, absolutely certain of their position in the hierarchy of things. He thought about the math that didn't balance on paper. Then he stepped through the hatch and went to find someone who could help. Inside the way station, in a corridor near the medical bay, Sevi stopped and waited for him. She looked small in the corridor's artificial light, smaller than she'd looked on the ice, somehow, as if the cold had been making her seem larger than she was. She had the thermal blanket still around her shoulders, like she wasn't quite ready to let it go. "The people we lost," she said. "The 11, some of them had families who don't know yet. The incident report will include them," he said. "By name, with full record, they won't be erased." She looked at the floor, then up at him. "The Keth said no survivors." "The Keth were wrong." She held his gaze. He held hers back. "Yeah," she said finally in Veth. "They were." He walked her to the medical bay, and then he walked Aka, and then he sat in the corridor outside while the Veth medical staff did their work, and he filed the incident report, and he sent the data chip's contents through 3 separate encrypted channels to 3 separate authorities, and he wrote up his own mission log in the plain, dry language of a single operator search and extract. Biosignatures located, persons extracted, data preserved, hostile engagement managed, all personnel aboard and accounted for. It was not a long document. It never was. He leaned his head back against the corridor wall and closed his eyes. The way station hummed around him, the deep background hum of a place that had been built to hold 1,000 different kinds of life and keep them warm. In the medical bay, he could hear the low murmur of voices, Aka asking questions, someone answering. The chip was in his inner pocket. The incident report was in the record. The 11 names were in the incident report. The message from the old array would reach people who could read it. That was enough for right now. He slept in the corridor, against the wall, with his carbine across his knees and his hand on his inner pocket, the way his grandmother had taught him to sleep when he had something worth protecting lightly, but without fear. 3 hours later, Sevi came out and found him there and looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the warmth of her was present against his arm. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Outside the way station, the sector was dark and frozen and very large, and in it somewhere 12 Keth combatants were filing their own reports, absolute in their certainty, 600 years of dominance behind them like a wall. They were wrong about a lot of things. They were wrong that there were no survivors. They were wrong that the data was destroyed. They were wrong, most fundamentally, about the way the math worked about whose story ended here and whose kept going. Humanity had been telling its story for a very long time, and it was still going, and it was still the same story. The road, the travelers, the one who stopped. The way station hummed. Dara Os slept in the corridor with his hand on something worth protecting and the warm weight of 2 people still alive beside him, and somewhere in the ice of a frozen moon, 400 meters down, an ancient array sat in the dark and said nothing, its message already delivered. That was enough. That was always enough.